Thanks for being here tonight. My name is Anna Meadows, and I'm an outreach coordinator for the Springfield Community Gardens. We're a nonprofit based in Springfield, Missouri, and our vision is a world where everyone has access to healthy local food. And this food forest workshop is a part of a larger workshop series on regenerative agriculture topics, and is generously sponsored by the USDA. So we're grateful for their partnership. Our speaker tonight is Patrick Byers. He's a horticulture field specialist with University of Missouri Extension. And I'll let him introduce himself here in just a minute. There's a couple of housekeeping things I'd like to go through first. First, there's going to be a question and answer session at the end of this workshop. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. It's two little dialog boxes and it says Q&A. You can click on that and then ask any questions there. And I'll be sure to relay those to Patrick at the end of the presentation during the Q&A section. If you have any comments, there's a chat button at the bottom of your screen. It says chat. It's a little dialog box as well. Feel free to put any comments in that throughout the night as well. And then also at the end of this workshop, after we all leave, a screen will pop up on your screen with a link to a post-workshop survey. And this survey is used by SCG's reporting to the USDA and also helps us provide meaningful workshops to y'all in the future. So we would appreciate it if you took a few minutes to fill that out after the workshop. But I'll also put that link in the chat box at the end as well. So you have a couple different mechanisms to use it. If you would like to refer to this workshop later after we finish, it will be available on SCG's USDA workshop playlist on our YouTube channel by the end of the week. And I will put the link to that playlist as well as our other social media and our website in the chat. So Patrick, thank you so much for being here. I think we're all excited to learn from you. So take it away.
Thank you, Anna. Well, it is indeed a pleasure to be with you here tonight. As Anna mentioned, my name is Patrick Byers. I'm a horticulture field specialist with University of Missouri Extension, and I'm based in Webster County in Southwest Missouri. And glad to be with you here tonight. Now, my interest in forest farming and food forests goes back to when I was a very small child, and I spent many pleasurable days rambling in the woods near our home near Des Moines, Iowa, and picking mushrooms and just again enjoying the woods. And as I matured and as I began my career as a horticulturist, I very early on saw the intersection between my love of the forest and my vocation as a horticulturist. And so those two different directions come together tonight in our workshop. And we'll be spending roughly 60 minutes talking about food forests and forest farming. Now, I'm using the terms interchangeably. If we want to get down to semantics, a food forest is probably a less formal designation. It would be a situation like we would see on a person's homestead, perhaps, or even in a backyard, where that person is consciously looking at the intersection of tree canopy and various types of crops that they can grow. Now, if we're talking about forest farming, oftentimes we're talking about that in a commercial context, where we're looking at options that are available for farmers to develop profit centers that are based in forested areas. This would be things like syrup production, for example, or mushroom production, or a medicinal herb production that can be done under the canopy of a forest. So we'll be using those two terms interchangeably. And I will mention that we'll be probably slanted a bit more towards the food forest approach tonight. But if you have any questions related to commercial production of crops in the forest, please let me know, and we'll spend as much time as needed to discuss those possibilities if that's where your interest lies. Okay, we'll have a PowerPoint presentation interspersed with videos. As Anna mentioned, if you have questions, please enter them in the Q&A, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end of our prepared remarks tonight. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, Anna, can we see the presentation?
We can see it.
Okay, very good. Well, again, our topic for tonight is food forests. And your presenter is Patrick Byers, commercial horticulture field specialist with the University of Missouri Extension. This workshop is a joint presentation with Springfield Community Gardens. Springfield Community Gardens is a nonprofit, community-based organization whose vision is a community where everyone has access to healthy local food. The Springfield Community Gardens organization manages a series of community gardens across Springfield and has in place a very innovative farmer development program with several farms that are available for people who are interested in exploring an interest in farming. So please reach out to Springfield Community Gardens, visit their website, their Facebook site, or their other social media sites. Our workshop is generously sponsored by the USDA through several grants that Springfield Community Gardens has received. USDA is a federal organization that supports farmers of all scales, and several agencies within USDA, including the Farm Services Agency, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and the Risk Management Agency, offer programs that will be of interest to farmers. All of these resources can be accessed at the farmers.gov website. A bit about myself. I work for University of Missouri Extension. My background includes 13 years with University of Missouri Extension. Prior to that, I worked for Missouri State University and the University of Arkansas. I'm also a farmer in Webster County. And again, I like to point out that I'm a guy who spends a lot of time in the forest, both as a place to seek peace and relaxation, but also a place to explore interests. So again, tonight's presentation is a nice way to blend my vocation and my avocation. So the outline of our time together tonight, first of all, we'll be defining the term food forest or forest farm. Then we'll spend some time designing. We're going to talk about how to put together a food forest or a forest farm, all the way from concept to detail. And I'll be using my farm as an example. I'm in the process of relocating to a new piece of property, and it's a clean slate. And we'll go through some of the thought processes using this new property of mine. Hopefully that will give some guidance to those who may be considering developing their own food forest or forest farms. Then we'll spend some time talking about selecting plants for the food forest, tending and growing a food forest. And then I wanted to talk about some specific plants that I'm interested in developing as far as a guild on my farm. So that's the plan for tonight. Again, any questions, please enter them in the Q&A, and we will definitely address them at the end of the presentation. I had a chance to travel internationally over the years, and in 2006, I made a volunteer trip to Uzbekistan, where I worked with farmers. These were primarily small-scale farmers. These were farmers who were just emerging from the communist era of collectivized agriculture. And during the era of collectivized agriculture, farmers were allowed a small plot of land, typically about between 1/4 of an acre to an acre in size, that they could manage as their own. And I had the opportunity to visit a number of these plots. These plots were typically around the homes of the farmers. And these plots were food forests in their purest sense. They included trees. These trees were fruit trees and nut trees. They included shrubs of many different types, fruit-bearing shrubs primarily. They had vegetables, they had flowers, they had grapevines, all of these in an amazing profusion of growth. And all of these worked. And it was very exciting for me to see how a culture and a group of people had developed these food forests as a response to their life settings. And so this was, again, a nice chance to see how large-scale adoption of food forests can make a huge impact on the food supply in these communities. And I think that the same possibility is available in the United States as well. So what is a food forest? Well, it's an example of perennial polyculture. And basically, perennial polyculture is a situation where we're cultivating perennial plants in groupings, in combinations. It's not the same thing as a monoculture orchard. Typically in perennial polyculture, again, we're working with a number of different plant species. And in fact, biodiversity is one of the hallmarks of perennial polyculture. And in the case of a food forest, this perennial polyculture is designed to mimic the natural ecosystem of a forest. And again, it's a managed setting. It's a place where we're doing things deliberately, and we're producing products that are useful. These could be food products. These could be medicinal plants. These could be ornamental plants. These could be vegetables or fruits. These could also be plantings that attract and nurture pollinators, beneficial insects, and other organisms that help support the activities on the farm. So let's take a quick look at a video to introduce the concept of the food forest and how it relates to an actual forest. I'm Patrick Byers, horticulture field specialist with the University of Missouri Extension. And the subject of our workshop today is food forests. Now, what exactly is a food forest? Well, a food forest is a great example of perennial polyculture. And perennial polyculture is defined as the cultivation of perennial plants in functional groupings. There are many different types of perennial polyculture. In the case of a food forest, it's a perennial polyculture that is designed to mimic the natural ecosystem of a forest. Now, a food forest is a managed setting, and the plantings that are included in a food forest are intended to yield useful products. These might be food products, these might be medicinal plants, these might be plants that provide habitat that attract and nurture life. Let's take a look at a forest setting. Let's see if we can discuss some of the aspects of a forest and relate those to a food forest. I'm Patrick Byers, horticulture field specialist with University of Missouri Extension. And the subject of our workshop today is forest farming. Now let's talk about the forest. And again, to the uninitiated, the forest is an amazing, mysterious, wonderful place. And I would certainly agree with all of those words. But the forest in reality is an ecological community. And a community is made up of individuals. Those individuals have relationships with each other. And that is certainly the case with a forest. So let's take a look at the forest and talk a little bit about what the ecological community might look like. Now, two ways to think about the forest are in terms of resources and in terms of layers. And these are the same concepts that we will use when we discuss the planning, the implementation, and the maintenance of forest farms. So let's talk first about resources. Now, the backbone of the forest and of a forest farm are the plants. And for plants to grow, they need resources. And those resources include sunlight, air, water, soil, and space. And the location of a plant in the forest and in the forest farm is dictated by the availability of those resources. We can also think about layers. And when we think about layers, we start with the largest plants, which are the trees. And frequently there is an overarching layer formed by tall trees. Then underneath that layer, there is another layer of trees. These are called understory trees. We then move down in stature to shrubs and vines, which are found frequently among the understory trees. We then move into areas of openings in the forest where we find herbaceous perennial plants. And then we can even move into the soil, and we find in the soil fungi and other soil-living organisms, and we see the movement of nutrients from plant parts, woody plant parts in particular, through decomposition back into the soil, where they can then be utilized by the plants in the forest. And we utilize all of these concepts when we discuss forest farming. A dominant part of the forest and a very important part of the forest farm is the canopy of trees, the taller trees. And if we look around us, we can see a glorious example of a forest canopy. And this is the similar type of a structure that we will develop on a forest farm. An important area in the forest and on a forest farm is the layer of understory trees. Frequently, these trees are smaller stature, generally less than 20 feet in height, and they're found under the canopies of taller trees. You can see around me some examples of understory trees. Another layer in the forest is the layer that is formed by woody shrubs. Here's an example with black raspberry. We also have blackberries growing here. These plants provide an important opportunity for diversity in the forest and on the forest farm. And in many cases, these woody shrubs are a dominant part of the forest farm. Vines such as these wild grapes
form a layer in the forest. And in fact, these are interesting plants in that they seek out resources. They clamber up understory trees or even canopy trees so that their leaves can be in the sun. On the forest farm, we also include vines, and these vines frequently climb up the larger trees in the forest farm or perhaps on structures, again, seeking out sunlight. Wherever sunlight reaches the soil, we have the opportunity for herbaceous perennial plants to grow. And here's an example along the edge of the forest, and we can see plants such as wild ginger and many other plants, again, an immense amount of diversity within a fairly small area. And we take advantage of this similar opportunity on the forest farm. Wherever we have sunlight that reaches the ground, it gives us an opportunity to plant a diverse group of plants that become an important part of the forest farm. A layer that is often overlooked in the forest is the fungi. Fungi are found on decomposing plant material. They're also found in the soil. They form an important part of the forest ecosystem, performing the very useful role of decomposition. We can also encourage the fungi that are found in a food forest. Sometimes these fungi appear naturally. In other cases, such as with shiitakes and oyster mushrooms, we can manage them as part of the food forest. From the standpoint of opportunity and diversity, there are two areas of particular interest in the forest and also in the food forest, and these include riparian areas and edges and breaks in the canopy. Riparian areas are those areas found along rivers and streams, whereas edges and breaks in the canopy are formed by natural openings, the falling of large trees, or perhaps the edge of a forest. Let's take a look at both of these areas. A riparian area is an area along a stream or a river, and frequently these areas offer abundant resources for plants, in particular water and frequently sunlight. Oftentimes riparian areas are openings in the forest canopy, and it allows for the growth of understory trees and particularly some of the woody shrubs. And here's a good example with a gooseberry plant growing along this stream. Now again, the same concepts apply to forest farming. And if we're fortunate enough in our landscape to have a riparian area, we can very easily utilize this as part of the design of a forest farm. Breaks in the forest canopy provide opportunity, particularly the opportunity for sunlight to reach the soil. And plants are quick to take advantage of this resource. Woody shrubs and herbaceous plants in particular thrive whenever there's an opening in the canopy. This may be a natural opening, it may be an edge, it may be an opening created by the falling of a large tree. But regardless, these openings are important. And in fact, these openings provide oftentimes the most biologically diverse parts of the forest. In the forest farm, we similarly take advantage of these openings. We provide these naturally by the way that we space the trees that form the canopy. And by allowing the sunlight to reach the soil, we can then encourage the growth of shrubs and herbaceous plants in the forest farm.
Okay, Anna, did we make it back to the presentation?
We did. We're here.
Okay, very good. Okay, well, hopefully that video highlighted the similarity between the ecological structure of a forest and the structure of a food forest. And from this point on, we'll be focusing on food forests, but I wanted those of us who are together tonight to see that direct comparison and how the concepts of a food forest developed by observing what goes on in the world around us. So again, when we think about the anatomy of a food forest, we're talking about canopy trees, understory trees, woody shrubs, vines, herbaceous perennials, soils and roots, and fungi. And we'll be revisiting these layers of the food forest a little bit later on tonight. Another concept that we'll introduce at this point is plant guilds. And a guild is basically an assembly. It's a grouping. It's a gathering of organisms that work well together. Beneficial assembly is the way it's sometimes described. Typically, we focus on plant guilds, but oftentimes when we think about the overall relationships in in a system that includes animals as well as plants. But for tonight, we'll be focusing more on plant guilds. And these plant guilds are the basis of design for food forests. If you can assemble a group of plants that have relationships that work well together, that just makes sense, and it makes the success of the food forest more assured. Guilds are mutually supportive. As an example, there may be a legume that's a member of a guild, and legumes as a group are types of plants that can capture the nitrogen in the atmosphere and then release it into the soil. And other plants that grow in the vicinity of legumes can then benefit from this nitrogen, which is then placed into the soil. So again, an excellent example of mutually supportive members of a guild. Now, we as farmers and horticulturists and food foresters can guide the development of guilds by what we plant, but we recognize that nature will have a hand as well. And in particular with the fungal layer, the layer of fungi within the food forest, many of these fungi will naturally occur if the environment is favorable for their growth. And favorable environments for fungi growth are frequently related to the types of plants that are growing in an area. So we may have some surprises in store for us as we guide the development of guilds. Some more concepts to consider relative to the food forest. Stacking. So stacking is a term that we use to describe plants. And in terms of permaculture, stacking means that a plant has more than one use from the standpoint of humans. For example, a plant may provide a part that we harvest. For example, with elderberries, we harvest the berries. But that same plant will also provide pollen that helps support the population of pollinating insects in an area. So again, we actually have two beneficial aspects to elderberries, and frequently there's even more than two. Another concept is zones of use, and this is related more towards human interactions in the food forest. And when we think about zones of use, we oftentimes think about convenience and locating portions of the food forest closest to the areas where we live that are going to be visited more frequently. For example, if we've incorporated some annual vegetable beds into a food forest, those are areas that require more maintenance and will be harvested more consistently and regularly than other parts of the food forest. So it makes sense to have that particular zone of use close to the house. Scale and pattern. So when we think about scale and pattern, it relates to the area that we're working with from the standpoint of design. If we're working with a small area for a food forest, we may not have room for a tree that will eventually reach 50 or 60 feet in height, but we may have plenty of room for a tree that might reach 25 or 30 feet in height. Pattern. Some food forests are regular patterns as far as the organization of the plantings. In other cases, they're much more random. Plan for abundance. One of the aspects of a food forest is that it's an inviting habitat for birds and wildlife, other types of wildlife that in some cases will feed upon the crops that we're intending to grow in the food forest. And it's a good practice to plan on sharing at least a portion of the harvest with these other organisms that will find their homes in the food forest. Stages of development. Just as a forest goes through stages of development, a food forest will as well. With a newly planted young food forest, it'll be a while before the canopy trees are large enough to shade areas. And frequently, the mix of species within a food forest during their early years of the food forest will be much different than the mix of species when that food forest is more mature. So again, a food forest is a process. It's not a static situation. It's a process where the design of that food forest will have a starting point, but who knows where the ending point is, and it's definitely going to change along the way. Contour. Contour is basically the elevation of a site, the changes in elevation of a site. And we can use this to advantage from the standpoint of placement of plants within the food forest. There are types of plants, for example, that do better in drier areas. There are plants that do better in more moist bottomland areas. And if we have a choice, we can plant plants in appropriate areas. And this is frequently related to contour. Okay, now let's talk a bit about designing and planning your food forest. And when we think about the design process, it's a multi-step process, and we'll go through this again using my farm as an example. But the process begins with goals. What is your intention? What do you want from a food forest? And if I were to have a group in person, which we hopefully will get to sometime soon, and I would ask each of you to tell me why you're interested in food forests, I suspect I would get different answers. And I have actually gone through that exercise to help inform me as a presenter. And in the past, in talking about food forests and perennial polyculture, here are the goals that I hear people talking about. First of all, being more self-reliant, particularly those folks who are thinking about homesteading and looking at parts of their life where they want to simplify and become more self-reliant. And a food forest is an excellent way to move along that path. Making an income, particularly if we move from the food forest to the forest farm, it is certainly possible to make an income from the products that are produced in the food forest or on the forest farm. Producing healthy food, frequently with the concepts behind food forest and forest farming, we're working with regenerative practices, and the food that we produce in these settings is healthy. Educating others. Many of us have a mission to share our passions with others. That's why I'm an extension specialist. And a food forest can be an excellent setting in which to share the concepts of a food forest, the concepts of regenerative agriculture, and the concepts of polyculture. And quite frankly, it's a fun project, and everyone enjoys a food forest, especially a food forest that's been established. What can be more fun than walking amongst trees and harvesting crops that are grown sustainably and just enjoying the overall experience. So these are the goals that people frequently have in mind when they're planning a food forest. Now, from the standpoint of my farm, from the standpoint of Byers Farm Food Forest, I had three primary goals. First of all, I want to gain a deeper understanding of perennial polyculture. What better way to do that than to actually try it out? Now, I have grown orchards in the past. I've grown berry plantings in the past. But this will be one of my first efforts to put together a true perennial polyculture, and I'm really excited about that. Secondly, I'm just innately a homesteader, and moving to this new piece of property has given me a chance to start from scratch in developing my homestead. And the food forest is going to be an important part of my homestead. And again, I'm very much a person who believes in self-reliance in as many aspects of my life as possible. So food forest is going to help me along that line, and certainly to produce healthy food. I expect to be harvesting crops from my food forest. Okay, so once we've established goals, the next step is to start to design a plan to get us to that point, the path to reality. And we'll go through several steps. And the first step in the design process is to observe the site. Let's take a look at the site that we're thinking about developing into the food forest. And perhaps we already have a tract of woods that we want to work with that, has the possibilities to already have a canopy in place. That's fabulous. If that's the case, wonderful. In other cases, you may be starting with an open field or perhaps even a backyard. But it's still very informative to go through the design process. And again, the first step, observe the site. You want to look at the site through the day. Where does the sun fall in the morning, midday, afternoon, and evening? You also want to observe the site through the seasons. Sunlight patterns change the seasons, and it can be very interesting to see where sunlight falls in the spring versus the summer versus the fall. And again, watch the sun. As was brought out in the earlier video, one of the resources that is critically important in a food forest is sunlight. And frequently, the location of sunlight relative to canopy trees and understory trees will determine where you can grow woody plants and herbaceous perennials. Where does water gather and move? And particularly on larger sites, there may be areas where water tends to gather after a rainfall. There may be natural areas where water moves across the site. It's important to identify those areas. What's happening around the site? A food forest is typically not an island. A food forest is in a setting where the reality is there are things going on around it. And particularly in urban settings with urban food forests, there can be things happening around the food forest that may impact the food forest. In rural areas, there could also be other things going on in agriculture, both plant and animal around a food forest that might have impacts on the design process. And then keep in mind that this observation should be an ongoing process. You can't learn everything about a site in one visit, in two visits, or even in a dozen visits. You need to be out there frequently just watching what's going on at that site. And again, back to my farm. Here is my farm from an aerial view. You can see that open field within the yellow oval. That's the area that I would like to develop into my food forest. Now notice that I have forested areas around it. There's definitely some buffering between my food forest and surrounding land uses, which is reassuring. There's also a creek. You can see Terrell Branch noted there on the map. There's also a road. But again, this gives you an idea of the location. Now, this is a bottomland field. There's not a lot of contour here. It's a fairly flat site that I'll be working with. And here's what that site looked like earlier today. And again, you can see the forest on both sides, but a nice open field, more or less a clean slate in which to develop my food forest. The next step in the design process is to create what's called base mapping. Base mapping is kind of looking at what's already there. You know, what are your starting points? And it can be helpful to mark out property lines. It can also be helpful to have an aerial view, as I had of my potential site. And a topographic map is helpful too, particularly if there are changes in elevation that can help you understand that. And you can layer all of these three types of maps together to come up with the base map. Now, the base map is frequently pretty informal, as you'll see here in a moment with my base map, where you just kind of draw things out and write impressions down and note things like sun and shade patterns and in the way the wind moves across the site and where things are located. But it's a great starting point. So let's take a look at base mapping for my farm. So again, here's a close-up of that area, and I've outlined it in a polygon. Now, the design process is fairly in-depth. And at this point, you know, we've got our base map in place. We understand where boundary lines are, where features are. You know, is it an open slate? Are there already things present there? Now that the next thing we're going to do is we're going to assess the site. We're going to start talking about details here. We're going to look at specific conditions that'll impact the design of our food forest. So we'll be looking at soil, water. We'll be looking at existing vegetation, sun and shade patterns, the way wind moves, whether or not there are structures, pathways, and other hardscape items at the food forest. And in some cases, you may be interested in managing views from the food forest. You know, if you've got a lovely view overlooking a valley from the location of your food forest, you'll be designing with that view in mind. So let's take a look at how it worked on my farm. So at my farm, an analysis of the soil revealed that the site had two different types of soil. These are fine, the base soil, fine sandy loam, and the Cedar Gap gravelly silt loam. These are both well-drained soils. I think they'll work well for my purposes. Both soils, upon testing, had a deficiency of phosphorus. Now, water flow. So it turns out that the field that I'm interested in, yes, it's a bottomland area near the stream. Now, the stream itself, there may be some potential for flooding, but there's actually a drainage from the field above me that runs near the site that I'm going to develop into my forest farm. And so I need to take that into account. And I've had a chance to observe that after several heavy rains. And thankfully, the water doesn't move across the site, it moves around the site. So that was reassuring. The existing vegetation is native grasses. There are some blackberries, black raspberries, and other things with thorns on. Unfortunately, I have quite a few multiflora rows that will have to be dealt with. My sun and shade patterns, again, there's forest on the east and the west side. There's good sun, though, over most of the day over this area that I'm going to develop. Late in the day, there is shade from the forest on the west side of the site that I'm considering. But again, I think I can work with that. Wind movement primarily from the south and from the north, depending upon where the particular conditions in a given day. It's an open field. There's native grasses. There's no hardscape. There's no development on this site. It was used many years ago as a cornfield, but again, it's been allowed to grow up into native grasses since then. And it's surrounded by forest that I own. So thankfully, I have some control over what goes on around my forest farm. All right, now that we've taken a look at what's going on there, now we're going to analyze the site and determine the course ahead. What do we need to do to prepare this site for a food forest? So in the case of my farm, soil and water, I'm going to create a berm to protect the area from flooding. Yes, I've observed it over the course of several heavy rains, but I'm still a bit concerned about the runoff from the field above me causing some problems. So I'll create a berm to divert that water away from my forest farm. I'm also going to create swales in the course of designing my food forest, and swales are raised areas that move water away from plantings. They can be helpful to catch water, but the purpose I'm going to put them to is to move water away from the planting. This is a bottomland site. There's not a lot of changes in contour, so I'll need to work with that to make sure I don't have areas where water sits. I am going to have supplemental irrigation. These are well-drained soils, and I would expect them to be dry during droughts. And as I mentioned before, the soil test revealed a deficiency in phosphorus, so I'll need to apply some phosphorus-containing fertilizers as I prepare the site for my forest farm. I'm going to have to work on that multiflora rose. My goodness, what a challenge, but I will get that under control. And then as far as the native grasses, I'll start by mowing the entire area so I can get a feel for what's there. I'm likely going to leave some of those native grasses because I want to have areas where I can walk around the parts of my forest farm. But I will have to control those native grasses in the areas that I plan to plant. And then as far as hardscape, I want a walking trail through my forest farm. I want a way to easily access the different parts of the farm. So I'm going to design it with a walking trail in mind. Okay, so the next step is to create a sector map. And the sector map is put together in response to the analysis that we're done. And basically what we're doing here is we're mapping the flow of energy. We're looking at what's going on in the site, again, relative to water, relative to air, relative to sunlight. Let's take a look at what that looks like. So here's my sector map. And there's the site that I'm thinking about. Again, as you saw in the aerial view, I have forest on the west side. I have some forested areas on the east side as well. My winds are primarily going to come from the south and the southwest. There is the possibility of north winds, of course, here too. You can see how the site is divided up between the two types of soil that I have. This particular site is about 220 feet from north to south and 115 feet from east to west. And my sun, of course, is coming from the south. And again, this, as I said, this is very informal, but it gives you a chance to just get a feel for where things are going to fall relative to the energy flows. I mentioned the issue of the overflow from the field above me. The blue lines represent where the water presently moves. And in thinking about where a berm might go, it's going to be along that south edge of the forest farm to divert that water away from my forest farm and then down into Terrell Branch, which is where it goes now too already. Okay, now the fun part. We're going to think about plants. We're going to think about that concept of layers that we talked about before. Now, food forests don't have to have all 7 layers. And in fact, some food forests are much simplified. Maybe there's only 3 or 4 layers. But there is the potential, particularly on larger sites, to develop all 7 layers. And I'm actually considering that in this particular site. So again, we're looking at the plants that would fit the site relative to tall plants, relative to tall trees in our first layer, our second layer of small trees, third layer of shrubs, the fourth layer of vines, the fifth layer of perennial herbaceous plants, the sixth layer of roots, and the seventh layer of fungi. So let's talk about these a bit more. Now, in thinking about the plants, we've got to accept some realities. First of all, we need to be very careful about our decisions relative to layers 1 and 2, because these are long-term decisions. Thinking about the trees that will be present at the site, both the canopy trees and the understory trees, these are more or less permanent decisions. It's difficult or impossible to move these trees once they've reached size. So we want to make sure that we put these where they need to be from the start. So again, it should be a very deliberative decision-making process to decide where we're going to plant layers 1 and 2. Now, layers 3 and 4, these are the vines and the woody shrubs. Yes, these are long-term as well, but we can change these if we need to. And in fact, as a food forest matures over time and shade patterns change, very likely we will be removing some of these woody plants where there's no longer enough sunlight to support them, and we'll move them to somewhere else in the food forest. And then the other layers, 5, 6, and 7, these are frequently adjusted, even early in the life of the food forest, where we plant the herbaceous perennials, where we plant ground covers, where we plant crops that are going to yield root crops, and even where we might be producing fungi. These will change as time goes by. For example, if we're interested in growing shiitake mushrooms on logs, well, those logs need to be in the shade. And as we develop more shade in our food forest, we can shift the places that we stack our shiitake logs. So again, parts of the food forest, yes, are more or less permanent, but other parts are going to change over time. Now, I mentioned stacking and multifunction, and this is an important thing to think about. And here's several plants that I'm particularly excited about. The lower picture of the blossoms, that's elderberry. Frequently, when we think of elderberry, we think of a berry crop, but here are the blossoms. Look at all the pollen that those blossoms are producing. This is wonderful habitat for pollinating insects. And then the other plant up at the top, that's comfrey. And comfrey is a good example of what's called a bioaccumulator. And bioaccumulating plants frequently have deep, wide-ranging root systems that can bring up nutrients from some depth in the soil. And they bring these nutrients up into the foliage. And then the foliage can be cut and lay on the ground, or at the end of the season, it will naturally die back. And now these nutrients are available for plants that have shallow root systems. So again, a very, very helpful aspect of bioaccumulating plants. Okay, we'll talk more about plants here in a moment. But now we're going to look at, we've been dealing primarily in concepts to this point. Now we're going to take these concepts and put them into a plan that can guide us as we develop the food forest. And then we'll talk a little bit about some patterns of design and some urban considerations here in a moment. So the concept sketch, next step. This is where we put together the sector and the base maps. We add in areas of use, and we start thinking about the guilds, those groups of plants that are mutually beneficial that are going to work at the site. So here's my concept sketch. And again, it's a rectangular area, but I wanted to break it into 4 smaller units. And as we'll see here in a moment, I have different guilds at each of these units. I wanted to have a place where I could relax in the center of the food forest, and that cross-hatched area in the middle is going to be a gazebo with a roof over it, and then areas where I can plant vines on the sides. And the brown line is going to be a walking path that'll take me in amongst the different use areas within my food forest. The next step is the schematic design, and that's where we start drawing in the guilds in detail. This is where we start identifying the plants within that concept plant. And this is when we start developing the plant species list. And so here's my schematic design for my food forest. And you can see I've actually taken each of those 4 use areas and I've divided it up now into plants. And I've noted where things are going to go. Now, the location of a plant is determined by the characteristics of the site. For example, my taller plants, if you look on this schematic design, you'll see number ones. Number ones are pecans. Those are going to be the tallest trees on my site. And those particular trees are going to be located along the north edge and the east edge of the forest farm. And the reason for that is they will throw shadows, yes. But if they're on the north side and on the east side, they're primarily not going to be throwing shadows on the other parts of the forest farm. And so I can accommodate other plants in the close vicinity of these pecan trees because there'll still be shade reaching the ground. Now, when the trees are young, I'll be able to plant plants among these trees because the canopies will not have closed and I'll have growing space. This schematic is more or less what things are going to look like as the forest farm approaches maturity. But we'll be focusing on that upper right guild here in just a moment. But you can see my plant species list includes pecans, American persimmon, pawpaw, semi-dwarf apples, honeyberry, elderberry, aronia, hardy kiwi, herbs, perennial vegetables, ginseng, and shiitake mushrooms. These are all plants that I have an interest in, and I'm going to incorporate all of these into the food forest. Now, you'll notice that there are several schematics that are outside of the area that I'm going to develop. And these are 11 and 12, which are ginseng and shiitake mushrooms. And the reason that I've located these there initially is that I'm not going to have much shade in the area early in the life of the food forest. And shiitakes and ginseng both require shade. So I'm going to place these crops in the areas where I already have existing canopy from the forest that's present on the east side. I'm sorry, on the east and west sides of my my selected site. And then as time goes by and the pecans begin to cast shade, I'll move these crops into the food forest as well. And then the final thing you're going to develop is what's called the detailed patch design. And this is where you take each of those use areas and you look at it in detail. You draw in individual plants, and this helps you put together the list of what you need to order and source to develop the food forest. And so again, if we look at that upper right use area, that particular area had 2 pecan trees, and I've selected the cultivars Kanza and Major. These are both good nut producers, but they're also very resistant to pecan scab, and they're well suited to growing in Southwest Missouri. And they also are of the types where they will provide pollination to each other. In the case of pecans, the male and female flowers need to be on separate trees to provide nuts. So having these 2 trees of different cultivars close together will be helpful. Number 4 is my semi-dwarf apple trees. And I've got 3 different cultivars, Enterprise, Liberty, and Gold Rush, growing on M7 rootstock. And again, a very deliberate choice here. Enterprise, Liberty, and Gold Rush are disease resistant, and M7 will provide a semi-dwarf tree that will fit in the space that I've allowed for these trees in this particular use area in my my food forest. And again, these are all working together. This is all part of the guild. Now, number 7 is Aronia. These are woody shrubs. There's going to be a room for 12 in that area between the pecans and the apples. Now, as time goes by and we begin to have more shade in that area, then likely I'll be removing the Aronia and planting something else so they can take partial shade and moving the Aronia somewhere else. But early in the life of the food forest, there'll be plenty of sunlight to support Aronia. And I've chosen Nero and Viking because those are berry types of Aronia. They produce good crops of berries. Hardy kiwi, number 8, is actually going to grow on the side of my gazebo. So that's why those are located down there. Notice that I've chosen Isai as the cultivar, but hardy kiwis have male and female vines. So I need to allow room for 1 male vine within the 4 female vines. So I'll put it in the middle. Number 9 is an area of herbs. This is an area that will be in full sun for a number of years. It'll be a great place to grow medicinal and culinary herbs. And I'm thinking in particular peppermint, comfrey, marjoram, and oregano in that particular bed. And then bed number 10 is where I'll be growing perennial vegetables. And again, rhubarb and asparagus, both perennials, are long-term vegetables. They'll be occupying that space for many years. I've chosen Victoria, which is a green-stalked rhubarb, very productive and adapted to Southwest Missouri, and Jersey Giant, which is a male asparagus that should do well there as well. And there's room for 10 plants of each of those. So again, here's my detailed patch design. I know exactly where things are going to be located, and I know exactly what I need to order when it comes time to source the plants for the patch design, or for the this particular bed in my forest farm. Now, I'll mention a couple of things. I've not spent a lot of time on these in my particular setting, but as you plan your forest farm or your food forest, you may be thinking about things like tree lines, hedgerows, and windbreaks. These plants can provide functions from the standpoint of moderating the environment in their vicinity. So there may be a use there. Sun traps, you can organize plantings in such a way that they utilize the sun. Typically, a sun trap is U-shaped with the open side of the U facing to the south. Edible trails. I've developed an edible trail in my food forest. And then again, the forest edge is a very important area. Early in the life of your food forest, there'll be lots of edges. As time goes by and canopies begin to close, you'll have fewer edges. But there are plants that you can move into these more shaded areas as the food forest evolves. Now, some urban considerations. Food forests work great in urban areas as well. Frequently, we don't have as much space to work with, but that doesn't mean we can't develop a food forest in an urban area. Now, there are some considerations related to the environment in urban areas, particularly things such as air quality, water quality, and light pollution. But probably the most significant issue to consider is impaired soils. And it may be necessary to remediate a soil before developing it into a food forest. But oftentimes, if there are impaired soils, these can be soils that can be used to advantage to develop a food forest. Let's watch a video now. My friend Kevin Prather manages a food forest in Southwest Missouri, and he generously gave me some footage. So let's go ahead and take a look at a bit of video footage where Kevin talks about his food forest. Sorry, it'll take me just a moment here to bring up the video. Okay, Anna, can we see the video now?
We can see it.
Okay, very good.
Hazel pine is a small, intensively managed, diversified specialty crop farm in Southwest Missouri. Kevin Prather is the farmer who manages Hazel Pine Farm. Now, Hazel Pine Farm includes a food forest. It's small scale, but it's a very important part of this urban farm. And the primary objective of the Hazel Pine Food Forest is to provide habitat for beneficial insects and pollinated insects that help support the production of the specialty crops at the farm. Let's learn more about the Hazel Pine Food Forest. Biodiversity is a critical part of a sustainable farm, and Certified Naturally Grown certainly recognizes that. Hazel pine has these areas that have been developed at the edges of the farm to support biodiversity, both pollinator habitat and habitat for beneficial insects. Kevin, tell us a little bit about this area.
Sure. Well, we planted these fruit trees 5 years ago. We have 9 fruit trees, which include some pawpaws, there's persimmons, some apples, mulberries, and around those originally were planted some guilds of just sort of beneficial plants to, to bring what we needed around those trees. We also have lots of clover. There's dynamic accumulators like comfrey out here, which, send out big root, pull stuff out from really deep, and then we would just drop the leaves, making those nutrients available to plants around it. We tried to, in the design, think of all of the layers of a forest from the canopy, which was going to be this mulberry tree. It's not looking so hot these days. And all the way down to the ground cover. This has been sort of the experimental zone for different things. Recently we've gotten into grafting, beginning with these pawpaws, which now each have 3 different cultivars of pawpaw fruit on them. But we also had a lot of volunteer trees that came up here, like some invasive mulberries, but rather than digging them out, we just hacked them off, got some cyanwood from this existing mulberry, the fruit of which we really enjoy, and grafted them onto the rootstock of these native mulberries. We did that because, as I mentioned before, this mulberry, it has some sores. I'm not exactly sure what's going on with it, but I want to make sure that I get to enjoy its fruit for years to come. So that was sort of our way of prolonging its life.
Well, it's a small thing, but it is an important part of sustainability, is using the assets that you have. For example, all of these wild mulberries that have grown up here, well, you could look at those as weeds and chop them out, or you could look at them as rootstocks. And we can graft improved mulberries onto them that will generate a crop of berries then for our enjoyment.
Yeah.
What I like about this area here, again, is that there's a diversity of plant species, which of course is key to supporting a diversity of beneficial insects and other organisms that are helpful on the farm. And again, as Kevin mentioned, we have different layers all the way from the tree canopy down to the ground cover. We're able to support a wide range of beneficials in this space. It's a relatively small space, but it's hugely important from the standpoint of the farm.
Okay, Anna, are we back to the presentation?
We're here. We can see it.
Okay, very good. Well, I hope you enjoyed that snapshot of a food forest in an urban setting. And And Kevin, it's obviously Kevin has a passion for that, and I want to thank him for providing that footage for us. So again, here is another discussion of those layers we saw earlier. And tall trees, small trees, shrubs, vines, perennial herbaceous plants, roots, fungi. And so we'll talk about these here now in some detail. Now, when we think about selecting plants for the food forest, lots of considerations enter into this. Certainly, we want plants that are adapted to the location of the food forest, both from the standpoint of overall adaptation and also adaptation to the microclimates that might be present there. We also want plants that have resistance to diseases and insect pests. We want plants that will be consistent as far as producing the crops that we're interested in harvesting. We want plants that are relatively easy to maintain. And quite frankly, we want plants, as I said before, that serve multi-functions, that have stacked aspects to them. Now, this next listing of plants, all the way from layer 1 to layer 7, are based upon plants that work well in Southwest Missouri. If you're not in Southwest Missouri, there's probably an entirely different list that will work well in your area. So you definitely want to find out what the possibilities are based upon your location. But here in Southwest Missouri, here are some plants that are frequently used in developing food forests. Layer 1, the tall trees, pecans, walnuts, maple, chestnut. These are all multifunction trees. Not only do they give us lumber and other wood products, but they give us nuts, or in the case of maples, they give us sap that can be made into syrup. So again, these would be examples of layer 1 trees. Layer 2 trees, these are smaller trees, pawpaw, persimmon, apples, pears, stone fruit, and jujubes. This is a picture of jujube. It's a fruit that comes to us from Asia, produces a wonderful fruit. It's drought tolerant, pest resistant, a small to medium-sized tree, an excellent choice to consider for the food forest. But any of these would be good smaller trees to include in layer 2. Layer 3, the shrubs. Yes, some of my personal favorites are in here, and there likely are others that could be included in this list as well. But here in Southwest Missouri, elderberries, hazelnut, aronia, gooseberry, currant, goji, and honeyberry are all good choices from the standpoint of that third layer. The vines we include in layer 4, grapes, tar, kiwi, and hops. These would all be good choices. This is a picture of hops over here. Layer 5, again, you're only limited by your imagination when it comes to perennial herbaceous plants that you might include. And yes, we focus on perennials in the food forest, but there is room for annuals as well. Annual herbs, annual vegetables, even flowering annuals have a place in the food forest. But these might include herbs, medicinal plants, greens, various types, perennial vegetables, legumes that I mentioned earlier. Again, legumes perform that very useful function of capturing nitrogen and then making it available to support the growth of other members of their guilds. So clovers and other legumes are again, a very important ingredient or component of a sustaining food forest. And then bioaccumulators, as Kevin mentioned with comfrey, and that's been my experience as well. Comfrey is a great example of a bioaccumulator. Layer 6, the roots. Again, Jerusalem artichokes, ramps, horseradish, root vegetables, and I'll add ginseng to this list as well. These are plants that where we harvest something that grows under the soil. So you could think of this as another layer in the food forest. And then the fungi. Nature cooperates from the standpoint of providing fungi because there's a huge diversity of native fungi that will grow. But we can also grow managed fungi in the food forest, and mushrooms such as shiitake mushrooms, oyster mushrooms, and others can work well from the standpoint of the fungal layer. This is a picture showing shiitake production on oak logs. Now, some special considerations, species palettes. When we think about the members of a guild, the types that we're going to grow, oftentimes there are common site characteristics that need to be considered. For example, my site is a bottomland site. It's going to have a well-drained, fairly deep soil. but there's not a lot of topography there. It probably isn't going to be a good place for certain species, but there are other species that work well in that setting. So we can put together a palette or a guild of plants that will work in that area. The same thing could be said for sunny areas, for partial shaded areas, for deep shade, for riparian zones, for acidic soils. You know, if you have these characteristics in the area that you're planning to develop into the food forest, think about the plants that will work well in those settings. And then there's functional palettes too. There are plants that provide particular functions for, you know, for example, we talked about the legumes and nitrogen fixation. We talked about habitat plants, bioaccumulators. We also need to think about cultivars. It's not enough just to say, I'm going to grow pawpaws. Well, there's probably 25 different cultivars of pawpaws that you can consider. And you might select a particular type because you like the characteristics of the fruit that pawpaw produces. Or maybe you want an early ripening pawpaw or a later ripening pawpaw. Or maybe you want a pawpaw that has some disease resistance. It's important to think about cultivars as well as plant species. And then pollination needs as well. I think I touched on it, well, I did with hardy kiwis. You have to have male and female vines. With persimmons, you need male and female plants. With pawpaws, apples, others, you have to provide for cross-pollination, which means you need different cultivars. So again, think about pollination needs, just as you would in an orchard setting. This picture, incidentally, is a close-up of the flowers on comfrey. It's just a lovely, lovely plant, as well as an amazing bioaccumulator. Now, as far as tending and growing the food forest, your basic keys for success: you need a healthy soil, adequate sunlight, adequate water, and disease and pest awareness. So let's take a quick look at all of these. And now it is important from the standpoint of tending the food forest to be realistic. You know, is a food forest a totally natural, self-sustaining system that requires no management? No, the answer is no. Now, with proper design, good selection of species and cultivars, you can minimize the maintenance, the management that's needed. But these are not systems where there's no management. If you let a food forest go in time, nature will take over. And yes, you'll still have a forested setting, particularly as time goes by, but from the standpoint of producing useful products, that will decline. So again, be prepared to manage the food forest. Base your management decisions on regenerative practices, you know, your choices of fertilizers, for example, or the ways that you manage the soil. These should be based upon regenerative practices. And again, I really can't stress the importance of proper design, especially if you want to minimize maintenance. Okay, so preparing a site, get that soil test. That's very helpful. If you need to make amendments, the best time to do that in the food forest is at the very beginning. If you need to modify the soil pH, this is a good time to do that as well. It's also a great time to start building soil health. And a wonderful way to build soil health is to apply organic amendments and organic mulches. So manure, compost, other amendments are very helpful. If you have some time, plant some cover crops. And particularly in areas that aren't going to be immediately incorporated in crop plants, yeah, plant cover crops. They'll give you the useful functions of a cover crop. Sheet mulching, you know, thinking back to the picture I showed you of the site I'm considering, there's a lot of grass growing there. How am I going to control that grass? I don't want to go out there and use a herbicide. I'm trying to develop this without the use of herbicides. So I'm going to think about sheet mulching. And basically with sheet mulching, you put down a layer of organic matter, and then you cover that with cardboard, and then you put another layer of organic matter on top of that. And you focus on the planting areas, and over time, you'll be able to kill out competing vegetation by using this approach. And then you can plant your crop plants, you know, your layer plants that you're considering. And then you heard me moaning and groaning about multiflora roses. Yes, you need to remove invasive species. They're going to be a problem, ongoing problem if they're not removed. So one of the first things I'm going to do is get rid of all of those multiflora roses. I'm not looking forward to that job. So planting, when you think about spacing and where you're going to plant, think about the mature size of plants. You know, those pecans are going to be planted 30 foot apart. And there's going to be a lot of space between them when they're young. But as time goes by, they will grow. And when they're mature, they will have covered that area with their canopies. And you want to think about that as time goes by. Now, again, with things like herbaceous perennials and even the woody shrubs in your planting, those may be more or less temporal. Those may go away as the first and second layers mature. But it's still important to plant these at the proper spacing so that you allow good air movement amongst the plants to reduce problems with diseases. Plant at the proper time. And then when you're planting trees, of course, do it properly. Again, these are long-term investments in your food forest, and you want them to get off to a good start. Now, ground covers and mulches. You should avoid bare soil. There are lots of ground cover plants. If you have areas such as paths or areas in deep shade, cover those with mulches. No bare soil. Think about those nitrogen fixing plants. There are a number of excellent ground covers that are legumes or mixtures of legumes that will fix nitrogen that can then be utilized by the other layers in your food forest. And then as you put down mulches, bark chips and other carbon-heavy mulches provide many benefits as they decompose. So if you have bare soil, cover it up. Cover it up with something, a living cover, or cover it with a mulch. Fertility management. Again, you want a healthy soil. A healthy soil holds and cycles nutrients. We have entire workshops on soil health and soil health management. So check those out. They're available at the Springfield Community Gardens YouTube channel. Adequate organic matter, target 3 to 5%. Non-water soluble nutrients should be added as you prepare the site. So if the soil test reveals a shortage of phosphorus or potassium, magnesium, or calcium, apply these nutrients in the form of amendments at that point, and adjust your soil pH before planting as well. Now, nitrogen is an ongoing need from the standpoint of the plants in your food forest. Now, where's your nitrogen going to come from? Well, annual applications of compost as they decompose will release nitrogen. Nitrogen fixing plants that I've stressed, those legumes, can be very helpful. And then organic fertilizers based upon animal manures, chicken litter, alfalfa. Those fertilizers can supply nitrogen as well. And then from the standpoint of maintaining plant health, again, it's important to do a good job in selecting species and cultivars when you think about the plants you're going to include in the food forest. Because if you plant disease susceptible or insect susceptible cultivars, sooner or later you're going to have to manage those problems. Now, it is true that healthy plants are less prone to problems. So if you choose plants that are adapted to your area and you do a good job of planting them and maintaining them, they'll be less likely to have issues. If you've done a good job of selecting species and cultivars that are resistant, that's great too. Observation is important. You want to be walking through your food forest frequently, just looking at your plants. And then think about IPM strategies. And I wanted to show a short video on how an IPM strategy might be put together for a tree that we commonly include in the second level of the food forest, apples. So let's watch a quick video here on cedar apple rust management on apples. Okay, Anna, can we see the video?
We can see it. Yep, we can see the video.
Okay, I'm hoping that's a yes.
Yes. Yes. Can you hear
Okay,
me?
very good. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, I can. I'm Patrick Byers, Field Specialist in Horticulture with University of Missouri Extension. Integrated Pest Management, or IPM, is a science-based, common-sense approach to managing the insects, diseases, weeds, and other pests that plague specialty crop growers. Let's talk about integrated pest management as it relates to disease management, and we'll use cedar apple rust as our model. Cedar apple rust is an interesting disease. Like many of the rust diseases, it shares two hosts, the cedar, the eastern red cedar, and an apple tree. And the disease spends part of its life cycle on one host and part of its life cycle on the other host. cedar apple rust overwinters on the eastern red cedar as hard knots that we call galls. In April, after a rain, those galls will then erupt and develop these orange growths that are called teleohorns. At this stage, spores are then spreading from the cedar host to the apple. On the apple, the result will be orange to yellow spots on the foliage and sometimes on the fruit. In a year of severe infestation, there can be enough damage to the foliage that the leaves drop, and after a number of years of infection with cedar apple rust, the tree can be weakened and made susceptible to other problems. When we think about integrated pest management and disease management, it's helpful to think about what's called the disease triangle. A triangle has 3 points, and when we talk about diseases, there are 3 points that we're interested in. Before a disease can become a problem, first of all, we need a susceptible host. Secondly, we need environmental conditions that favor the development of the disease. And third, we need the presence of the disease. In the case of cedar apple rust, let's take a look at each one of the points of that triangle. First of all, let's turn our attention to the apple tree. This apple tree is a cultivar called Enterprise. Enterprise has genetic resistance to cedar apple rust. In other words, the natural genetic makeup of this tree makes it resistant to the development of cedar rust disease. So that's very helpful from the standpoint of managing disease. Again, it's looking at that first point of the triangle, which is the presence of a susceptible host. Now let's talk about modifying the environment. And if we look at this tree, we notice that it has been pruned to a modified central leader system, a very open system. There's plenty of room for air to move throughout the branches of this tree. The foliage and the fruit dry quickly after a rain. By training the tree in this fashion, we have developed an environment that is less favorable for the development of cedar apple rust. Third, let's take a look at the presence of the disease. As I mentioned, cedar apple rust overwinters on the eastern red cedar, and it overwinters as these galls that we see here. If these galls are not present in the vicinity of the apple tree, then we have fewer problems with cedar apple rust. So one aspect of managing cedar apple rust is to eliminate the alternate host, or the other side of the disease. If we notice that adjacent to our orchard, we have some eastern red cedar trees, and it would be beneficial from the standpoint of managing cedar apple rust using IPM to remove those trees. That would remove the overwintering side for this disease and reduce the amount of cedar apple rust that might be present close to our apple trees. So to review, from the standpoint of integrated pest management and diseases, it's useful to think about the disease triangle: the presence of a susceptible host, an environment that favors the disease, and the presence of the disease itself. In the case of cedar apple rust, by selecting resistant cultivars, by training and pruning the trees to an open structure, by removing the overwintering side of the disease, the eastern red cedars, we can reduce the situation of cedar apple rust infection in our apple orchard. Okay, Anna, did we make it back to the presentation?
Made it, yes.
Okay, very good. Now, from the standpoint of watering, the first step is to drought-proof the soil, and the way you do that is by adding organic matter. Again, targeting about 5% organic matter. Organic matter helps the soil to hold moisture, and then that water is available for plant growth during dry periods. Mulches, you'll want to use mulches liberally in the food forest, particularly around the woody plants, the trees, the shrubs, and the vines. You want to design the site to hold rainfall, but again, you want to move excess rainfall off. But through the use of swales and contouring, you can hold water on the site. During the establishment year, the first year, you'll need to water your plants regularly. The root system's becoming established, and it's important to water as needed. But in an established food forest, most of the watering focuses on the herbaceous perennials and the fungi. Trees, shrubs, vines frequently only need watering during severe droughts. Again, if you've done a good job of selecting adapted plants, they'll be able to endure some degree of drought. Now, as far as the the guild of plants that I'm going to include on my farm for my food forest. Here, thinking about pecans for layer 1. Layer 2 would be pawpaw, apple, and persimmon. Layer 3, elderberry, aronia, honeyberry. Layer 4, hardy kiwi. Layer 5, herbs, asparagus, rhubarb, and comfrey. Layer 6, ginseng, and layer 7, shiitake mushrooms. And I'll mention layer 3, I'm also going to plant some hazelnuts. So I thought I'd put together a short video to highlight some of these plants and hopefully perhaps to generate some discussion here at the end of the presentation. Okay, Anna, are we back at the video?
Yes, back at the video.
Okay, very good.
An enjoyable aspect of planning, implementing, and managing a food forest is developing plant guilds. And I'd like to share with you the plant guild that I've developed for Byers Farm Food Forest. Now, developing a plant guild is a thoughtful, deliberative process. In my case, the considerations that I kept in mind as I developed this plant guild was, first of all, these plants must be adapted to the environmental conditions of Southwest Missouri, which is the location of the food forest. Secondly, the plants should be pest resistant, and they should also have reduced or manageable maintenance. The site is a moist site. It's a bottomland site, so the members of the guild should be adapted to a moist bottomland site. I'm interested in plants that will give me food. I'm also interested in medicinal plants, so this helped guide my choice of plants for the plant guild as well. I like multifunctional plants, those plants that will contribute more than one aspect to the overall food forest. I also like plants that are attractive in their own right, and I'm interested in managing and maintaining wildlife habitat. So this was the thought process that went into developing this particular plant guild. My first layer, the canopy layer, will be pecans. Layer number 2, which will be the understory trees, those trees of smaller stature, will include pawpaw, apple, and persimmon. The third layer, the woody shrubs, will include elderberry, aronia, honeyberry, and hazelnut. The fourth layer, the vines, will include hardy kiwi. The fifth layer will include herbs and perennial vegetables among the herbaceous perennials. I'm interested in trying my hand at ginseng for a root crop. And the seventh layer, the layer of fungi, will include shiitake mushrooms. Let's take a look at a number of these different plants that I plan to include in my plant guild. The canopy layer of the guild that I've selected for my food forest is pecan trees. Pecan trees in time will make a large tree. They provide a nut crop. They also provide habitat for birds and insects, and perhaps my descendants will be able to harvest the lumber or the woody products from these pecan trees. Pecan trees take a long time to mature, so while they're small, I'll have plenty of sunlight to work with. And as the guild evolves over time, I'll adjust the plants that are growing near and under the pecan trees. I'm particularly excited about the understory layer of trees in my food forest. And a good example is the pawpaw. Pawpaw is a native fruit here in Missouri. It provides an abundant crop of delicious fruit. It also provides habitat. For example, the foliage of the pawpaw is a food source for the zebra swallowtail butterflies. It's also, again, a food source for many different types of wildlife. It's a beautiful tree when it's grown. I enjoy it because of the blossoms in the spring, the foliage, and also the fruit harvest that I mentioned earlier. So pawpaw will be an important part, the second layer of my food forest. Semi-dwarf apples will be part of the plant guild in my food forest. And of course, they're part of the second layer, the understory layer. In selecting apples, it's important, first of all, to select disease-resistant apples so that the impact of diseases is minimized. And secondly, to select apples grafted onto semi-dwarfing rootstocks so that they fit within the space allotted to them in the food forest. Apples, of course, are a wonderful source of fruit. Again, a thing of beauty as far as the tree itself, and also a habitat area for birds and other types of wildlife. My food forest will include the American persimmon as part of the second layer, the understory layer of trees. When mature, American persimmons will be about 25 feet tall. Remember with American persimmon that you need both a male and a female tree, so include both if you want to harvest the delicious fruit from the female trees in the fall. Persimmon is a wonderful wildlife habitat fruit. An important plant in the third layer of my plant guild, the woody shrubs, is the American elderberry. The American elderberry produces a crop of fruit and blossoms that have medicinal value. Of course, you can make lots of wonderful things from the berries too, jellies, jams, juices. The plant is a wildlife plant. The flowers produce an abundant pollen crop that supports pollinating insects. And of course, it's certainly a plant of beauty. The third layer in my food forest guild will include aronia, sometimes called chokeberry. Aronia, of course, is a lovely plant. It produces a crop of dark-colored berries that are very high in antioxidants, very healthful, and I'm growing it for that purpose. It's also, again, a good habitat plant for a number of different wildlife species. The third layer of plants in my food forest, the woody shrubs, will include the honeyberry. And these honeyberries produce an abundant crop of delicious berries early in the season. It's also a beautiful habitat plant for wildlife. An excellent woody shrub to include in the third layer of my plant guild is the hazelnut. This is an American hazelnut, produces nut crop that supports wildlife, and if I'm lucky, I'm able to harvest some myself to enjoy. The fifth layer of my food forest is going to include a wide range of medicinal plants, and a good example is peppermint. And peppermint is a wonderful ground cover. It does a great job of protecting the soil. It's a strong enough competitor that it can grow amongst weeds. It actually will thrive in sun as well as in partial shade, so it's an excellent plant to include in that fifth layer. And what's not to love about peppermint, particularly the fragrance. There are perennial vegetables that can be part of the herbaceous perennial layer in a food forest, and my plant guild is going to include rhubarb. Rhubarb, of course, is a perennial. It's long-lived. In a warm climate like Missouri, it actually does better in some of the shadier areas in the food forest. The guild in my food forest will include a fungal layer, and a good example of what I plan to have in my fungal layer are shiitake mushrooms. Shiitake mushrooms are grown on logs, and this is a great way to utilize some of the smaller trees that I'll be cutting from my woodlot, those trees that might be a bit on the small side for firewood. I can inoculate these logs and then place them in the shady areas in my food forest and grow an abundant crop of shiitake mushrooms. And in time, I'll be able to harvest mushrooms.
Okay, Anna, are we back to the presentation?
Yes, back to the presentation.
Okay. Now, we're just about finished with the prepared remarks, and looking forward to a conversation here and question and answers here at the end. I did want to mention that there is commercial scale potential in the food forest and forest farming. And historically in Southwest Missouri, this is focused on nut production. Pecans, walnuts, and more recently, chestnuts are all good nut producing trees to consider for layer one in the food forest. Fruit and berry production, we touched on a number of the different fruits that could be grown in a food forest. And, certainly a lot of interest recently in pawpaw and persimmon, but some of the more traditional fruit crops such as apples and pears, various types of berries work well in a food forest setting. Syrup production, again, historically, maples were the primary species that was tapped for syrup production, but in more recent times, focus has shifted to other species as well, such as walnuts and even trees such as sycamore. Mushroom production, we highlighted shiitakes, but there are a number of other mushrooms that can be grown on a commercial scale in a food forest or on a forest farm. Medicinal herb production, certainly ginseng, but a number of other medicinal herbs can be grown in a food forest. And then specialty vegetable production. You know, I touched on rhubarb, but there are other vegetables that can be grown in a forest farm setting as well on a commercial scale. And if anyone has questions or would like to further discuss commercial scale production of any of these products, please reach out, and I'd love to sit down and have a conversation about the commercial potential for your site relative to any of these potential crops. So in conclusion, you know, why are you interested in a food forest? That's the first question to answer, and that's the first step in the planning process. And that's also the attitude that will guide you as you install and maintain a food forest. Do you know how to design a productive food forest? You know, we went through some of the basics today. There are lots of resources that can help guide you in the design process. But remember, the design process should be your own. You should be thinking about your own needs as you design your food forest. Which plants will you choose? You had a chance to see what some of my favorite plants are, but what are your favorite plants? And how will you maintain your food forest? Again, it's always a good idea to think about regenerative practices when it comes to maintaining the food forest. So here is a list of references. Many of these have been around for some time, but they're still good. My presentation today was guided in particular by the Food Forest Handbook by Fry and Solba. So I heartily recommend that, but any of these would be good references. I'll mention two organizations, the University of Missouri Center for Agroforestry and the Permaculture Research Institute, as organizations that have fabulous online resources that are available. But any of these would be good places to start from the standpoint of developing a food forest. So at this point, Anna, let's open up the floor to questions. Do we have any that were entered into the Q&A?
Yes, we do. The first question is from Megan, who says, what is the pest pressure like in regards to wildlife? Is it common to put up fences to keep deer out, or is this not a significant issue?
Deer are a significant issue, and I expect deer to be a significant problem in my food forest. So yes, deer can be a problem. The habitat that we provide sometimes is a double-edged sword from the standpoint of harvesting crops from our food forest. Animals like squirrels, raccoons, deer can certainly consume the edible crops that we had hoped to harvest. Deer can be very damaging to the woody plants in a food forest, and so it's important to think about how we're going to manage those particular animals from the beginning. Yes, a food forest is a natural setting, but as I mentioned at the very beginning, it's also a managed setting. And one of the things that we have to manage are potentially destructive pests such as deer.
The next question asks, how would you manage peach leaf curl this time of year?
Peach leaf curl is a fungal disease of peaches, and the management for peach leaf curl is focused on the dormant season, the dormant period. And peach leaf curl can be managed with copper-containing sprays that are applied when the tree is fully dormant, which typically means between November and February. At this point in the season, there really is no active way of managing peach leaf curl. Now, trees that have an infestation of peach leaf curl need to be nurtured. It's going to be very important to help the tree regrow the leaves that it's lost. And for example, watering during dry periods, maintaining fertility, and keeping weed competition at bay will be very helpful in helping the tree recover from peach leaf curl.
Let me try again. I was muted. How important is it to prune trees in a food forest? Would this be done as frequently as an orchard?
Generally, the pruning of trees in a food forest is less intense than it would be in an orchard, a more or less traditional orchard. In a food forest, sometimes we sacrifice some degree of productivity to ease of management. That doesn't mean that we don't want to develop strong structure and to maintain an open structure. It just doesn't mean we have to be as detail oriented as we would be in an orchard. Now, particularly early in the life of the trees, both the canopy trees and the second layer trees, it's important to develop good structure in those trees. But once the trees are mature, then pruning is generally less intense in the food forest than it would be in an orchard.
Okay, those are all the questions we have right now. Oh, no, there's another one popped up. Can you incorporate livestock into food forests?
Livestock can be incorporated into food forest. Poultry, for example, can be easily incorporated into a food forest. When you move into small ruminants like sheep, it becomes more of a challenge because in many cases you'll have to isolate the animals from the plants. Yet they can exist in the same space, but small ruminants and goats in particular can be very damaging to plants in the food forest. So it's necessary to come up with ways to exclude them from actual contact with the plants. But yes, there are creative ways that you can incorporate livestock into a food forest, especially early in the life of the food forest.
Do we have any other questions right now?
Any other questions to the Q&A? Well, if not, my contact information is here on the screen. And please feel free to reach out by email or telephone. I'd love to visit with you further about your interest in forest farming or food forests. And I thank you for joining us.